react to what John presented. You don't have to, but if you want, I'd gladly give you the word.
Well, first, I want to thank John for his lecture. I think we spoke about exactly about the same thing on two different fields.
Yes.
My approach was how to say that an ontological one about what is a trauma, and I think that John exactly explained in what does it mean, a crisis, and the traumatic crisis. And I think that it is an excellent illustration of what I wanted to say. I think that it was possible, John, to you were speaking about what I call the extra phenomenon always, because you didn't say, as many people are saying, that it is a crisis, but it is just temporary. It is a crisis, but there is a form of resiliency. It is a crisis, but we will change, and so on. So I completely agree with you. And the second point was interesting in my way. It is when we spoke about the importance of you spoke about the iPhone and so on, and the importance to be in a physical situation, face to face. So I didn't speak about that because it is a question of body, but I think that this question is also a very important one.
Okay.
For example, it is now we are face to face, but it's not exactly the same as if we were all together. So I think that this point is also a very important one.
John, would you please? Would you want to? Yeah.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel, and immensely enjoyed your presentation, which was it used COVID as an example, but this was really about the entire question of philosophy today. And so I do have questions for you, but they're more on that level. I trying to put this briefly, it seems to me that you're beginning to question whether the event can be handled completely by phenomenology at all. So you're talking about the extra phenomenon and about reality. And I suppose I think that's right. And I think that there's a sense in which, if we're talking about phenomenology, we've always got a spatial picture in the background. You know, a horizon is a spatial metaphor, you know, because things that appear to us in some sense within space. But an event is something that arrives in the course of time. And even though, you know, from the outset with Heidegger, phenomenology was concerned with time, I think there's a real question as to whether phenomenology can handle time. And I think that's part of the challenge of the alternative Bergsonian trajectory. And you know, I think it's very significant that you mentioned Deleuze, who lies within that trajectory, even if his interpretation of Bergson is probably very unsatisfactory, but nonetheless, it's within that trajectory. And so what you seem to be registering is that if everything appears to us within a certain horizon that is like a meta phenomenon, nonetheless a trauma is a point where that horizon is interrupted. So something can arrive in time from reality, if you like, in excess of that which appears, you know. Now, I think my question is whether, nonetheless, you're still caught within some of the framework of the people you're criticizing. So my problem with Heidegger, Levinas, Marion, and so on, is often that I think that when they're talking about a kind of arch phenomenon, when they're talking about something which doesn't appear, they can only talk about it in negative terms that to me seem to be ultimately the terms of the Kantian sublime, not the terms of transcendence. So it seems to me, my question to you would be whether by focusing on trauma, this is a kind of negative interruption of the phenomenality. And in a way, you're still characterizing it in archi-phenomenal terms. And what about the moment when life resumes again because another event arrives? What about the moment when another child is born? Isn't that also a moment in excess of phenomenality coming from reality? Because it's the moment when a new horizon is established. And therefore, it's not just trauma that proves reality. And, you know, the danger with Levinas is surely of a kind of Manichaeanism, you know, that reality over against the personal is something terrible. And with Henri as well, again and again, it seems like a mode of Cartesian dualism is reconfigured in some way, that there's something very bad and something very good. And how far is this acceptable within a Catholic philosophy? You know, within a Catholic philosophy that in the end has to have a point of mediation between what appears and what doesn't appear, between the unknown and the known. Okay, it's a mediation that's an intuition or faith, but we're talking here about something like analogy, if you like. And I think that relates also, you know, do we experience analogy? Is that a phenomenon? Yes, but it's as if it's a point where we interpret reality and we experience our interpretation. It's a point where there's no priority, if you like, between the hermeneutic and the phenomenological. And therefore we are, if you like, after all, I think, in the metaphysical. And so if I can just sort of, and this is what it seems to me, people like Gabellieri and Bellantone are saying, you know, respectfully to people like Marion and Henri and Lacoste. But they're nonetheless, I think, saying something here that's important. And, you know, just to bring this down to your example of, you know, in love, do we only share our loneliness? You know, my response to that might be, well, how do we know that? I mean, Charles Taylor talks about, you know, the buffered self as something very modern. How do I know that when I, you know, see the dawn with my wife, that we're not experiencing the same thing? That, you know, indeed, in some sense, without going the full way with Malebranche, that we are sharing the same mind of God in some sense. How do we know that we're completely isolated? And you know, I think there is some truth in the sense of there is something radically incommunicable inside us. So I'm not totally disagreeing with you. And you know, it's because of something radically incommunicable that we do value the other. But nonetheless, the fact of the phenomenon of personality or of character, you know, so that there's something a friend of mine can do that I can't do. But doesn't that suggest that his singularity, although it's locked up inside himself, somehow also isn't completely locked up inside himself, because he expresses it, because it does get through to me in some sense, and indeed it affects me and can transform it. So this would be another case of sort of beyond phenomenology, arriving reality in time is reconfiguring the phenomenological situation. Sorry, that's far too long a question, and it takes us away from COVID. But your paper was not primarily about COVID, so this was the question I wanted to put to you.
Very good, excellent, John. Thank you. Now, Emmanuel, can you wait for eventually some other questions, and then you bring them together? Yeah. Let me ask the participants: Is there a question ready to be presented to any one of the speakers? Well, I don't see any hand, so this is good. So I then, Emmanuel,
can
please.
I speak?
Yes, let me see, just a second, I need to, there we go, where is, yes, Professor Falque, very good, we have 3 questions. Now we start the phenomenologist from Georgia. Professor Vila-Chã, please.
Thank you for both reporters for very profound, interesting, original, modern view about the phenomenology from the phenomenology of hidden phenomena and from the political philosophy point of view, political philosophy. And my question is, my understanding of phenomenology is that phenomenology means something, revelation of subject against the objectification of knowledge, objectification of emotion, objectification of thinking, and eventually objectification of being. That is a motive, and that is a process of phenomenological openness. And it seems to me that my first question is Professor Emmanuel
Okay.
Yes, Emmanuel Falque. My question is to you about that. It seems to me that you speak about some synthesis, some connection between phenomenology and metaphysics in your book at the first glance. But then I rethink it's not quite so, because you speak about some hidden and unobtainable phenomena, which is not given, which has no meaning. It's beyond meaning and beyond givenness. But nevertheless, if I use Husserl's language, I always take into account these unknown and unobtainable things. And that means that it differs from metaphysical thing, because metaphysical thing always is covered with darkness. And in this case, we have here an interphenomenon, which I take into account. I cannot perceive it, I cannot see, I cannot think about it, but I take it into account. And this taking into account is a very important point of phenomenological cognition. And when I love my wife, because the sides which I cannot see in her, because I cannot recognize in her, this I take into account this hidden side of her nature. And our communication, which is based on uncommunication, really is a form of life. And this form of life means that eventually means the communication. So the difference between metaphysical thing for me and this interphenomenon consists in the fact that interphenomenon I can always take into account. I speak about the non-existing things. Let me remember the fragment from Marcel Proust's novel, when the young man, author of the novel, waited for the beloved woman, and she did not come. And then he thinks that non-existence of this woman make this garden more beautiful, more charming. So non-existing things sometimes is more effective, more influence than presence. So your thesis that resistance to the presence is just for my mind, that is a revelation of subject against the objectification of the being at all.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have many questions, but now.
Yes, very good, excellent. I know. It's great.
Myself.
Thank you for your question. Thank you. I suggest that
I don't want to you many times.
Yes, very good. Emmanuel and John, maybe can you gather the comments, the questions, and then at the end, okay? Is it okay?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
very good. So I'd like to give the word now to
There is another question.
No, you have 2 more questions at least now. Yes. Is okay? Very good. Dr. Burukina and in Moscow from Russia, and then Dr. Yonut from Asia. Yes, Olga, please.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you very much.
Go ahead.
At first, I would like to thank both speakers because actually, well, it was a great pleasure, and I would say this session was an eye-opening for many of us to listen to living philosophers of this height, of this value, of this range. Thank you very much. I have a number of questions to both speakers, but as far as I understand, now I am to ask questions to our French professor, Professor Falque, right?
I would advise that you ask 1 or 2 questions to Professor Falque, 1 or 2 to Professor Milbank.
It's okay.
Okay.
All right. If you have them.
Just Emmanuel is fine.
That's right. Go ahead. The time is running out, so please go ahead.
Yes. I have a number of questions. So my questions to Professor Falque. Speaking about opening ourselves and maintaining our openness. A question here is the first question: can common people, not psychologists, maintain their own openness? And what are the tools of opening ourselves, and what are methods of staying open? Also, your definition of crisis that you provided, does it mean that an overwhelming majority of people, practically everyone, lives in a state of crisis? Because most people do not want to live here and now, or cannot, unable to live here and now, but live either in the past or in the future, that is, in their memories or reminiscence or in their dreams. And one more question. Speaking about body, it is not a question but a comment. Sick, wounded, or paralyzed body turns into a cage for the mind, and certainly turns into an object, not a subject. And the mind would rather part with such a body, leaving it and changing it. One more comment, very brief one. Speaking about transformation, you said that actually we have to change, and indeed, physiologically, we are changing every second of our life. And psychologically, we are changing constantly, emotionally, for instance, under the influence of your wonderful presentations, we have changed already. But every person is a complex and compound and complicated system, and every system strives to preserve its stability, its sustainability, its state of not changing, of a state of not transforming. So here is a paradox of between the reality and the strives of every system, including such a complex system as every person is. These are questions to Professor Falque, and just 2 short questions to Professor Milbank. So speaking about engineered mass trauma, which you mentioned, here is a question. Is it always engineered, even in situations of natural disasters, or is it engineered from the very beginning, that is a priori, or does it get engineered at a certain point, and why? And the second question about domination. The world of today is full of competition and competitiveness. Isn't it a strive for domination? And another question, every person strives for self-affirmation, which is natural and found not only in the period of getting older or gaining maturity, but practically all through a human life. Isn't self-affirmation a kind of domination in a certain circle, of which size depends on internal and external characteristics of particular people and their circumstances? Thank you.
Thank you, Olga. Thank you very much. Yonut, please. Where are you? Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. I have I have a problem with my voice. One question to Professor Falque and one question to Professor John Milbank. If applied to the current COVID crisis, your argument, Professor Falque, gives me a lot of worries, because it means that this pandemic, precisely because it took us by surprise and it disarmed us, it left us without our capacities for reaction. It means, do we need, and here I bring the political reflection to which John Milbank alluded already. This is why we need the heavy arm of the law to direct us like a sheep. Does it mean we need the state, the power, because we just lost our humanity in state, because of this is a state of exception, right? As Agamben has said. So are we bare life in the case of this crisis? And in case of any global future crisis, is there a need for an authority to deal with what we cannot do by ourselves? And if it is so, I want to say I highly disagree with your argument, right? Okay, but this is my question to you. And the question for Professor Milbank is, because it has been, I have read in the newspapers that European states are preparing mandatory vaccination for people. I am in favor of vaccination, but how about mandatory vaccination? What do you think about this? Because one thing is to be vaccinated and to wish to think this is important for solidarity, to have yourself the idea of your contribution. When I took my vaccine, the nurse in Romania said, she was so proud, and she said, you have no idea how much you contribute to the whole world, to the research in the whole world. And I felt proud. But how about now? Things will change completely after January 1st, where some states are are about to impose mandatory vaccination. I want to learn your opinion about this.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yonich. Thank you very much. I'd leave Emmanuel, would you, and then if you have time, we can have another round. But for now, let's go to the questions we have already on the table. Emmanuel, please.
Okay. So thanks. Many questions, and so it's difficult to respond to all those questions. I will just give some remarks. First, for John, thanks for your question. The first question you raised is the question of the limits of phenomenology. I completely agree. The subtitle of my book is Essai aux confins de la phénoménalité. So it is the limits of phenomenology. And as you know, I am a phenomenologist. I can say that. Do I am always a phenomenologist? That is not the questions. Because if you ask, are you always a phenomenologist? You are thinking that phenomenology is a sort of orthodoxy, a fashion of the suit and something like that. And that is not the question. And in fact, I am anchored in the last Merleau-Ponty, because in fact, the last Merleau-Ponty raised exactly the same questions.
Absolutely, yes.
Well, that's why my book on Freud is anchored in Merleau-Ponty. And Merleau-Ponty asked to himself that are we always in phenomenology when we interrogate the question of the limits of phenomenology? I can say yes in the method, but not yes in the object, because in fact, I am a phenomenologist because I try to describe a phenomenon. To describe the phenomenon of the pandemic, to describe the phenomenon of the illness, to describe the phenomenon of the death of a child. But that sort of phenomenon destroyed the possibility of the phenomenology itself, as the phenomenology has always been sought. in that way, of course, I understood the other questions about intentionality, or someone said, how do you know, it's a good question, how do you know that, that in fact, nothing is accessible anymore? Because if you know that nothing is accessible, you know something, so you are always in knowledge, so there is always intentionality and so on. In my way, it's not radical enough to only object that because you know something, the thing you know, that this thing will not destroy your capacity of knowing. It means that for me, a trauma changed everything. In that way, it doesn't mean that there is nothing anymore. It means that we have to construct in another way. So then the second point, you quote Bergson. Of course, because in fact, for me, the opposition between metaphysics and phenomenology doesn't mean anything. Because the question is not to say you are a phenomenologist and you are a metaphysician, and now the metaphysicians are against the phenomenologists, as the phenomenologists were against the metaphysician 20 years ago. So it means, for me, it means nothing. The question is, are the things themselves. Of course, I didn't found, after 30 years, something like that, I didn't found in phenomenology the means to think what I want to think. So of course, I came back to Bergson, and I quote a lot Bergson. And for example, you spoke about the question of time. Time is not only a dimension of a consciousness, but time is a dimension of the things themselves. The things, not themselves, but the things, the reality. So there is a form of reality, but, and I want to insist on that point, because many of my colleagues in France, Claude Romano, for example, but many of them are working in the way of Quentin Meillassoux and about what they call the realisme phenomenologique. I don't know if you know that. Huh? The phenomenological realism. But what is the phenomenological realism? It's not absolutely not Max Scheler or Edith Stein, huh? What we call phenomenological realism during the years, the 20s. But it is to say there is something objectively.
Yeah, I know.
Okay, but for me, the trauma is not objectively. Because when you are speaking about something objectively, you said that something exists outside of yourself, but it is not the question. So my question is not the question of realism or idealism, because the attempt of realism today in phenomenology is a sort of denunciation of the limits of phenomenology, of course. But the way is completely different, because my way is an existential one. It is not an epistemological one. And I think that point is very important. Then you raise the question of Catholicism and mediation and analogy. And of course, and for me, the question of analogy is a very important one. And I think it is what phenomenology missed. Because phenomenology is always, French phenomenology, but also German phenomenology, is always thinking in terms of rupture. Revelation is a rupture, everything is a rupture.
That's
and
right.
I am completely against this schema of rupture. But it's not enough to speak about relation. It's not enough, because when I spoke about the vinculum, when I spoke about the link, it is a form of analogy, of course. But this form of analogy is not only a form of participation. Voilà. I just want to say that it's not enough to speak about rupture of analogy. We have to speak about mediation, but mediation in Catholicity too is transformation, because resurrection is transformation.
Yes.
So we can't think the question of participation only, the question of analogy only as participation, but we have also to think as transformation.
Oh, completely. Yes,
and in that way,
yes,
it's not
yes.
exactly the same as Thomas
Yes.
Aquinas.
This
But
is so true.
perhaps it can be in Blondet, perhaps it can be in
Yes.
Edith, but it's
Yes.
not the same. No, but I
No,
completely
I agree.
agree with you on that
Yeah.
point.
Yeah, I agree.
So, but voilà, I completely agree with you that this question is a very important one, but we have to overcome the overcoming of metaphysics. Of course, I wrote it, but we have to overcome the dissociation between phenomenology and metaphysics. The question is not phenomenology of metaphysics, but what are the concepts you need? What are the author you need to think what you have to think? Of course, I quote Deleuze, but I quote Deleuze not because I am a disciple of Deleuze, but Deleuze helped me to think that point of transformation. That's it. It doesn't mean that I will always. But thanks for your question, and perhaps we will have time to continue. I hope our discussion. Okay. There is well, I respond about the question of objectivity, phenomenology, and metaphysics, which was the second question. But in this question, there's a woman who said, I don't know her name, Olga. It was Olga, no? Who asked this question? Olga Borkirina, I see. No, it was not. Yeah.
Dr. Dalitze, yeah.
Okay. When you say that I take in account, in my account, the trauma, I take it in my account. Of course, I take it in my account. Of course, I consider my trauma and so on. But the trauma destroys the possibility of taking it in my account. That is the point. And you have to be, I try to be completely radical. It means that the trauma is not an object that I can aim. It is not an object that I can experience because it destroys the possibility of experience itself. That's why I don't speak in my book about, for example, the experience of non-experience, exactly what Jean-Yves Lacoste did about revelation, but I'm speaking not about inexperience, but about an experience, the act to block the question of experience. In fact, the model of what I'm speaking in that book is a model of the cinnabar in Kant. I don't know if you know this example of the cinnabar. I quote Kant because I have a chapter about the cinnabar. The cinnabar is just a moment in the critique of the pure reason, or where Kant imagined the impossible possibility of something which is completely contradictory and we can't receive it in experience. I quote it. If the cinnabar, it is a red color in the painter. If the cinnabar...
Let's may make one comment, please. One comment. May I make one comment? Only two please. So you speak not about the intentionality to, but no. You speak about the intentionality from. Intentionality from just means to go.
No, that is what Husserl. No, it is what Husserl is doing. Exactly what you say. It is exactly what Husserl is doing. Is IDN 1, paragraph 58, and it is a commentary of Ricoeur in the note. When Ricoeur is exactly said that when you see the chaos, you continue to see the chaos. But me, I don't say that you continue to see the chaos because the chaos destroys the capacity to see. It's not the same. It's not the same. So I read the text of Kant for me, which is absolutely very important. If the cinnabar was sometimes red, sometimes black, sometimes light, sometimes heavy, if a man sometimes turned its Kant into an animal, sometimes another, if in a long day, the earth was sometimes covered with fruit, sometimes with ice and snow. Conclusion, my empirical imagination could never find the occasion to receive in suit, the heavy cinnabar with the representation of the color red. It is exactly what Kant saw it is exactly not an exception of phenomenality, but an exception of phenomenality which destroys all phenomenality, which destroys the transcendental structure. And I add that this example of Cinnabar and Deleuze saw it. This example of Cinnabar appeared only in the first edition of the Critique of the Pure Reason in 1781, and it has been suppressed in the second edition in 1787, and Kant substitutes the structure of the je pense, I think, at the place of the Cinnabar. It means that Kant himself has been afraid by this possibility he saw. And I think it is exactly the same as Husserl. He saw the possibility of the neantization of the world, and he said, but the ego always remained. Heidegger saw it reading Nietzsche, but he said, the chaos is not disorder, the chaos is not the plenty, the chaos is not Anaxagore, the chaos is opening, Hesiod. It is not what Nietzsche saw. So I just want to say that when you see the extra phenomenon, it is so difficult to speak about it that you can always say, of course, but you are speaking with a structure of thinking, of course. When I say that, quand je dis, en français, quand je dis que nous faisons le tour du hors-phénomène, et que le hors-phénomène, c'est comme des trous, je ne sais pas qui comprend, je pense que tout le monde comprend, que le hors-phénomène, c'est comme des trous dans un tissu, et que nous ne pouvons que contourner les hors-phénomènes, mais jamais descendre dans le hors-phénomène, parce que nous nous perdrions si nous descendions dans le hors-phénomène, ce qui fait que nous ne sommes jamais en résilience, mais en portance et en contenance du hors-phénomène. Effectivement, je tourne autour du hors-phénomène, mais le langage peut le faire. Mais quand le langage tourne autour du hors-phénomène, ce n'est pas de la théologie négative, ce n'est pas de la philosophie négative, qui serait une philosophie du dépassement du langage. On est beaucoup plus près de la Cora de Derrida que de la philosophie, que de la théologie négative de Marion. I hope you understand. I don't know if
Thank you. Thank you.
C'est la même chose.
Very good. I suggest.
John, speak in French. I speak in English.
I'm delighted with your help.
Okay. All right. I suggest that John, would you like to answer what you have on your card?
Yes,
or please.
Just first of all, I'll address the questions from the other participants. The question of mandatory vaccination is very difficult. I mean, I think the last time it happened in Britain was smallpox in the middle of the 19th century, which was regarded as a very serious threat. Although, as a matter of fact, vaccination programs have historically arrived towards the end of diseases. Another novelty about COVID is how quickly vaccination has been resorted to. This is something very unique. Ever since 1945, for very obvious reasons, we've been very chary about any kind of mandatory medical processes. And so, as you can imagine, in the British popular press, the headlines about Germans and Austrians contemplating this have been, as you might imagine, predictably jingoistic, if you like. But nonetheless, my instinct is that you should avoid mandatory vaccination if you possibly can. That it would require something incredibly extreme to justify it. And I don't think we're at that point. I think it's inherently worrying to impose any medical procedure on people. But I think for me, the other problem about it is that so far, at least in Britain, the voluntary approach has worked very, very well, so that people, as in the case of the lockdown, there's been an extraordinary degree of popular assent. But I think as soon as you become too draconian, for example, early on in the lockdown, we had police arresting walkers in the countryside in a totally unnecessary way. As soon as you do that, you risk losing popular assent. And actually, to deal with a crisis like this, you totally need voluntary participation. Because otherwise people will find a way of subverting what you're doing. You need goodwill and cooperation. So even at a pragmatic level, but I think that also ethically it's right to preserve that principle of solidarity, and that if we are talking about sustaining specifically human life, if it's no longer voluntary, the risk of objectification of human beings is very, very strong. And so that, I think that would be my answer to the other question about engineered trauma. To some extent, there's been unavoidable trauma that has just arrived from reality. But I think the more that we sort of deliberately like people being isolated, then the more the danger is of an extreme dialectic of enlightenment setting in, whereby our control over things becomes our control over ourselves, and we increasingly simply treat ourselves as objects. And that might be experienced as trauma, but more worryingly, I mean, I don't know about you, but I found that during prolonged lockdown, I start to lose the will to travel or to engage. It's easier just to stay at home, that I become kind of soporific, so I'm not so much traumatized as I'm tranquilized, and I think that's incredibly dangerous process, so that we've against medicalization. I mean, the other question about self-affirmation, we tend, as Bergson says, to feel joy because at some kind of achievement, some kind of attainment that goes sort of beyond mere pleasure. But I don't think that needs to be at the expense of other people, or even at the expense of sacrificially of ourselves. I think the more it's a genuinely creative achievement, the more it's not really in competition with other people. I mean, I think, look, you can have benign modes of competition. We can't possibly get rid of all that. It's natural to human beings, but if beating other people becomes the prime end, you're never going to genuinely achieve something. And any genuine achievement can be appreciated by other people. Other people share in your joy and achievement. And so genuine flourishing, I think, is like that. But I think the current world is all based upon competition, and social mobility is seen as, the prime goal. What about most people who are not going to succeed very much? Do they not deserve fulfilling lives? Of course they do, but we would have to organize things very differently. And I think we've seen in the pandemic just how much we depend on people doing humdrum jobs, and they're worthy of dignity and respect. And we need their jobs to be seen as far as possible as skillful and fulfilling, I think. So, just to get I'll talk with Emmanuel just very, very briefly, and I don't want to detain people. Yeah, look, I think basically we're in agreement about overcoming the divide between metaphysics and phenomenology. So if Emmanuel is admitting metaphysics, then for my part, I would say that every philosophy is doing phenomenology to some degree. You know, there's phenomenology in Plato, there's phenomenology in Aristotle. There's no question. You can't deal with being without describing appearances. It's impossible. I suppose that my sense of the extra phenomenal is sort of sometimes less dramatic. I think that all the time, because completely new things arrive, and because we have to interpret things, there is something like the extra phenomenology. I don't think we have to say that either hermeneutics or phenomenology is basic, if you like. I think that we're always doing both, something along those lines. And therefore, in the end, we have to conjecture about the whole of reality. And there's some sense in which we experience that as manifest to us. And that takes us into ritual and liturgy and religion and so on. And I think Emmanuel and I are both on the same trajectory here of overcoming, you know, some of these divisions. And the way in which the 20th century, whether we're talking about analytic philosophy or phenomenology, was kind of too anti-metaphysical, and therefore sometimes, you know, failed to address the biggest questions, you know, the kind of questions that Hegel addressed. And, you know, whether one agrees with Hegel or not, I think we now realize we can't avoid them because of the crises that we live in. Absolutely, I agree with Emmanuel. I'm not talking about a kind of Meillet sort of realism of the object over against the subject. In fact, you know, I would go further and say that realism, genuine realism, doesn't have a duality of the object and the subject. That genuine realism thinks that there's some kind of participation of form, if you like, between things and us, of the kind that you have in Aristotle or in Aquinas. You know, so that absolutely it's the attitude of modern empiricism and epistemology that thinks of objects over against subjects. You know, as Whitehead put it, you know, subjects are also part of nature. Our feelings are also part of nature. You know, why should we imagine that our feelings are not disclosive of the way things are? For example, that there isn't some kind of continuity. So absolutely, I would also, if I was talking about in some way restoring a realist ontology, it would be along these spiritual existential lines, not at all, oh, there are things that would be the same things even if human beings weren't there. You know, if you like, it's a Berkeleyan kind of realism, if that's not a contradiction in terms. It's not a kind of Lockean type of pseudo-realism that isn't really realism at all. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. About the question of the reality. In fact, yes, in my book and in my lecture just this afternoon, I spoke about the question of the real.
Yes.
And you see, the term of the real, or in fact, the term of the real is used by Maldinet.
Interesting, yes.
Il don't say le réel, il dit le réel. And le réel, it is what I was not, ce que je n'attendais pas, what I was not expecting. And it is a phenomenological definition. And then you have Lacan, he said the réel is l'inassimilable.
Yes.
But a very interesting question is why those two philosophers and psychoanalysts are using this term of réel. And it is very interesting because Maldinet used this term and never Heidegger should use this term. The real is the thing, but it is never the thing independently of myself. Yeah. And that's why the trauma happened to myself and destroy myself and is not independent of myself.
Yeah.
And the second point you just raised, but which is absolutely important, because you just said in fact, so we are all traumatisable, but we are never all traumatised. Nous ne sommes pas tous traumatisés. But we are living always in some traumatism. There are many phenomena. But I just want to say that what I call the trauma, which is what we are speaking about, and not only the pandemic, but the illness, the separation, the death of a child, the natural catastrophe, and the pandemic, in fact, they revealed what is our structure. And it is Deleuze which said, I think he's right on that point, he said, we have to distinguish between the shock, it is John Scott Fitzgerald, which is between the shock, he said the eruption of the volcano, and la fêlure. The fêlure is something which is broken myself.
Okay,
I add that Jean-Louis Chrétien is one of his last book, Fragility.
Brilliant book. I've read it. It's a brilliant book.
Yes. And distinguish between fragility and vulnerability.
Yes.
We are speaking too much about vulnerability.
Can I just...
Fragility is exactly what the pandemic revealed to us.
Can I just say...
It's not only our weakness.
Yeah.
It is not only vulnerability. It is the fact that something is always broken.
Yeah. Can I just ask you two quick questions, Emmanuel? I mean, does your view of trauma as, you know, interrupting the phenomenological horizon, doesn't it rely on the notion that the trauma is absolute? So my question would be, is there ever an absolute trauma? You know, however bad it is, have we ever arrived at an absolute trauma? My second question is why should it be the case that this terrible trauma is most disclosive of reality? I mean, maybe it's disclosive of reality because we live in a fallen, deluded world. But for example, during COVID, people cooperated and they didn't go mad. Well, a lot of people were predicting they would go mad. The fact that people cooperated in an unexpected way and states, isn't that also revelatory of reality? Very, very simple question.
Emmanuel, just a moment, please. I'd like to see if Alexander, you raised your hand for quite some time. Would you like to put your question now so that we can round up, please?
Sure, I'll make it quick. Thank you very much, Professor Milbank, and merci beaucoup, Professor Falque. C'était très intéressant. Voilà, j'ai une question. I have a question for Professor Milbank. It's piggybacking off of the question about mandatory vaccination. In hearing your lecture, what comes to mind is a sort of almost maybe an inherent tension between common good and in the judgment of individual conscience, and the perhaps collapse of liberalism as a response. What do you see in communitarianism, not in the French communitarianism, but in the other that you're proposing, as a response or as a potential response? Because I'm not sure, I can't see how to resolve that conflict.
Okay, before giving the word to both John and Emmanuel, I would like to ask, is there any other question, any other of the participants? Yes, Bartolome.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. And here I will go to ask my question to Emmanuel Falque. As I from to Mary 3 or 4 months ago. My question is about your discourse about the love. And I say, which part we can find the love? Is it inside principle, with the definition you give about the love, we can take it as some experience inside the people or is outside people, because quand vous parlez des liens, donc le lien entre les deux personnes qui favorise cela. Je voudrais un peu comprendre dans ce sens-là, l'amour, c'est une réalité qui se vit à l'intérieur des personnes ou on peut le considérer comme une réalité extérieure. Merci.
Okay, is there one last question still? No, seems to be okay. So I give the word now. Maybe John, would you like to answer the questions or answer the questions and make your final comment, and then I'll give the word for the same to Emmanuel, and then we have to finish because we are here over time, but it's so beautiful and so rich that we are all very pleased to be here. So please, your answers and your final comments.
Just very, very quickly. I think there's not necessarily a tension between the common good and individual liberty. It depends how you're defining the common good, if you like. And if you think of the common good just in terms of medical convenience, then even though, you know, medical health is important, it's not sufficient. You've got to think of the common good as a shared good between people, and human dignity requires their collaboration. In other words, I don't think of the common good in an impersonal collectivist way. I think of it much more in terms of a relation, an organic relation between persons. So it's not a collectivism and it's not an individualism. And I think if you're thinking in terms of personal relations and a flourishing of individuals that can only be relational, that it requires cooperation and interaction with other people, then obviously, you know, that nobody can rule out all conflicts between overall needs and individual needs. But nonetheless, I don't think in principle on a kind of communitarian virtue ethics, personalist basis way of looking at things that we've come to call post-liberal, I don't think that inherently you have that conflict.
Okay, Emmanuel.
Okay, thanks. I think, John, your two questions are very difficult questions. The first, is there an absolute trauma? In fact, I think that how traumatic, the question of the trauma is in fact a structure of human being. But in fact, we don't want to recognize it. We don't want to accept it, because we are always seeing all the things through the idea of identity and of permanency. Or the trauma destroy this idea of identity and permanency, because we are completely changed, destroy. I said on the subject, there is a desubjectivation, hypersubjectivation, and transformation. Okay, so the point is the fact that, and then it is your second question. In fact, I don't say that we have to create ourselves, but I say that because of what it's happened to me, some other possibilities opens to me. But it is not me who opens other possibilities. Exactly when you say, for example, I think that in this pandemic period, we create some new form of relations together. But are those new forms only a sort of copy of the ancient thought. I mean, are we only now in a sort of privation of presence en chair et en os? Is it only a privation? Are we only now, this afternoon, in a privative situation? Not. We create a new situation. Si je le dis en français, c'est pas la même chose de dire que nous sommes normalement en chair et en os et que malheureusement en ce moment on n'est pas en chair et en os et qu'on est en visioconférence et que la vraie vie c'est la vie en chair et en os. Non, nous vivons une vraie vie en mode de visioconférence. You understood? And I think that point is very important. We create new possibilities because we don't have
real,
choice. We don't have choice. And I think that's the point. So what is love? To finish, Barthélemy, you asked me, is loved in ourselves or outside? But in fact, when you are seeking that, you are thinking that we are first the people, we are separated, and then we will link the people. But it means nothing. Because in fact, I think that we are always linked. But we are always linked by our incommunicability. I disagree with Heidegger. We said we are always together, and then the loneliness is a privation of the act to be together. I never said that. I said that loneliness is positive, not negative. It's always negative in philosophy. Le solitaire, c'est négatif. Le solipsisme, c'est négatif. L'isolement, c'est négatif.
Not in Rousseau.
Rousseau, c'est négatif. Oui, mais Rousseau, mais le solitaire chez Rousseau.
Or Wordsworth.
We can discuss that. Donc, in that case, I think that love, if love is a link, the question is not to say if it is inside or outside. It is the act, c'est l'acte d'être in Thomas Aquinas, the act of being par lequel nous sommes. Voilà. Donc, in fact, I develop what I call a phenomenology a minima. It is absolutely not a phenomenology of excess, but this phenomenology a minima, love is quasi nothing. There is no event. It's impossible for me to share with you who you are, but this phenomenology a minima can say a maxima what we are, human being, even with God.
Mm-hmm. Heaven is good. As it was very good, extraordinaire être ensemble ce soir. Nous sommes ici depuis 3h30, à peu près 3h30, et donc il faut terminer parce que les événements sont comme ça. Ils commencent et ils continuent, mais ils continuent après qu'ils finissent ou qu'ils s'interrompent d'une certaine façon. So thank you very much. I was thinking, as Emmanuel was talking about the new character of the event, this kind of event that you are realizing together, as a truly important remark, because I think for us, for those of us, I mean, in first place, the two of you, Professor Milbank, Professor Falque, to have accepted our invitation. Of course, believing, and I do believe, that we can create, that we need to create and recreate new spaces of reflection, of philosophizing. Actually thinking a little about the idea of Jasper's, the zien philosophieren, which must go on, must continue. I think this is an important way of resisting the pandemic, of interrupting the powers, that kind of anecdotal expression. If we don't resist, then the virus becomes the Pope. It's a serious danger. And I think it is time for us, for all of us, but philosophers in particular, intellectuals, public intellectuals, like all of us, I'm sure we are trying to be, you are, all of us are trying to become we really need to take in our hands this determination and make the decision to continue to pursue the goals of philosophy by the way of phenomenology, by the way of social political thinking. We need to face the challenge of the real in whatever form it appears, trauma or less trauma, but indeed we are always traumatized. And I think the big trauma is that is when we don't recognize the trauma in which we are living. So it's the tragedy. That will be a real tragedy for our time if we don't realize where we are, what is happening in us and around us, inside and outside, and live as if nothing counts, nothing is nothing. That kind of nihilism that is, in a way, a projection of many interests in our culture and in our societies, because nothing is more convenient to totalitarians and totalitarianisms, beginning with the technological one, to make us believe that what we think, to think does not matter. Well, we believe strongly, and you too, John and Emmanuel, proved it in an extraordinary way, that thinking matters deeply, matters seriously, and matters in a way that, well, for those of us who are believers, only God truly knows. But here we are facing the challenge. And I think COMIUCAP as a network is certainly very grateful for this event, for the fact that this is takes now place, will finish in just a few seconds, and will continue to take place because we are determined to continue to think. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, your deep thoughts, your way of thinking, your process of thinking. Was beautiful to witness that. Two thinkers of the high caliber thinking together, one first, then the other, and then coming together with this discussion. I think this is a marvelous event, a marvelous example of what philosophy is called to be and is called to do. I, for one, don't want to give up. And if COMIUCAP, while it is there, can be of any help, and I know that some of you are here because you recognize that importance, that mission. So let's do it together. I hope to see you all again in the near future. Of course, it would be nice to see John again in Braga, Portugal, where I am right now. You probably remember that almost 20 years ago. I hope you come back. Yes. Or in Rome, where actually the last time we met was running into one another without knowing, yes. That we are in the Vatican in some room there. Yes. I don't remember exactly where. And Emmanuel, it's always a great pleasure, to have your readiness and your generosity, as John's generosity to contribute and to make